All right. Google tells me that we're on air now. So, what's
Great.
up, Roman? Thanks for meeting with me.
Thanks. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, totally. I'm really excited to talk with you. I think your book is actually, I mean, it's such a small niche topic, I'm sure, but I think that I actually do think that it's really important for reasons that I hope we'll discuss. But yeah, so the short of it is I'm actually really excited to talk to you about this stuff because I've been interested in kind of the intersection between Christianity and radical politics for a long time. But as you might not be surprised to hear, there's not too many people to talk about this with. So yeah, I've been thinking about this stuff for a while, and so I'm really eager to have your attention for some time now. So I'm thinking one of the best ways to just kick things off would be to ask you a substantive question, just to ignite the conversation, and then we can go in any direction you want. But basically, as you note in your book, there are pretty explicit commentaries in the Bible or passages in the Bible that seem to suggest the early Christians lived quite literally in communist organized groups, that they actually structured their relationships and their lives under pretty explicitly and radically communist lines. So in particular, in the Acts of the Apostles, it says, and I'm quoting from your work, it says, all who believed were together and had all things in common. And that's the title of your book, All Things in Common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. So there seems to be in the Bible some statements that the early Christians lived as communists. Could you tell us a little bit more detail? Is this true, and exactly how did they organize their relationships in this way, just in a nutshell?
In a nutshell. So yeah, it is true. And the two passages there are known traditionally as the Communism of the Apostles passages. So it's Acts 2:42 to 47, 4:32 to 37. And those are the explicit ones where they say they held all things in common. They sold what they had and they distributed it. And in chapter 4, it says that they didn't consider anything that they had as their own or as their own property. It depends on the translation. And so these are the passages that stick out the most. But there are other passages within the New Testament and then within outside the New Testament, such as in the Didache, the Epistle of Barnabas, and then later on in church fathers such as Tertullian and Justin Martyr and others that describe the same thing using different terms. And then there's things in the Pauline letters, for example, that don't directly address the communism, but give hints that it's something that's really happening. So, for example, in one of the letters, I think it's 2 Thessalonians 3, he talks about people who are basically trying to take advantage of the system, trying to travel around to different communities and benefit from the system, from the communism, without contributing anything. And the same thing is in 1 Peter, talking about how some of the families would just sort of drop off their widows, and that he's saying that, well, you should take care of your own widows before you drop them off. There's just tons of evidence out there that these things were happening, and even outside Christian literature, you have probably one of my favorite hints at the communism. It's not even a hint. The direct evidence is a Lucian in the 2nd century, who was a Roman poet, and he wrote this kind of story making fun of the Christians, having this figure called Proteus, who would go around and he would scam the Christians, take advantage of them. And he was trying to paint this picture of the Christians as being kind of stupid, kind of naive. And he describes their doctrine, trying to give a summary of who the Christians are and what they believe. And he basically describes what their core identity is that they hold all things in common. And that they in his words, he says they despise everything equally, that they despise property. So, and that's his way of sort of making fun of them. And so you have all this evidence out there that there was something going on substantive. And the way in my book I reconstruct it, I kind of use two different approaches. So one is I use the categories from economic anthropology, and specifically I rely heavily on David Graeber, his book Debt: The First 5,000 Years, and some other works as well. And in that book, it describes different forms of social organization or social relationship, hierarchy, exchange, and communism. And in those categories, communism is basically any situation or any relationship where the principle of from each according to his ability to each according to his from each according to his ability to each according to his need is the operating principle. So I use that as a category. And the reason I went with economic anthropology is because a lot of, or many other sort of commentaries and histories would look at those passages, look at what's going on, and they try and use more political, like they try and think of sort of modern post-Enlightenment political categories of how to run a country, right?
Right.
And in their viewpoint, they think like capitalism against communism or socialism or whatever. And they're thinking, well, which category do the Christians fall into? Or they use economic ways of thinking. Like they'll think, okay, maybe are they setting up cooperatives or something like a sort of monastic community?
Right.
And so they'll think in those terms. But I don't think that works using those categories. And I think that because there's a couple of reasons. The early Christians weren't a state or anything like a state. They didn't have any authority to make laws. They didn't have an army.
And that's really important, actually, right? Especially for thinking about why this matters today or how this imports into timely political conversations right now. Because, whenever you talk about communism today, whenever radical folks talk about something like communism, the immediate rejection that people always come up with, and it's fair enough, it really is, it's that that could never work. You could never change the capitalist system because, so the rejection, in other words, is assuming that the communist project is about changing a political system or an economic system from the top down. Like that's what everyone assumes you mean whenever you talk about something like communism. So
right.
what you're saying is really important, because what you're saying basically, or at least the way that I'm reading you, is that the early Christians actually were pretty content to leave Roman law alone. Like they were kind of indifferent to it. And really what they were trying to do was create communities on a totally different kind of spiritual, emotional, and ethical basis. And so that's actually what communism refers to in its most serious and mature and workable form. It actually has to do with what you call economic relationships, not economic system. Now, there was a material component to it. They did have systems in place, but they were kind of organically generated and based on a restructuring of relationships. So I just wanted to flag for listeners that what you're talking about is not arcane economic history distinctions, but it's actually super relevant for current debates, because the most common way to reject communism is to say that it's a failed system, it can't work as a system. But no, the Christians show that there's something much deeper that communism can mean that actually works.
Right, and the interesting thing about that is the word communism has become such a sort of toxic word. And to be honest, a lot of it can also come from those who are proponents of communism. So you'll hear a lot of, especially like Marxists, and I have nothing against Marxists. I think they do a lot of good work, but a lot of the time they will define communism in the sense to where it's almost become a paradise-like system that is so out there that it is almost immune to any analysis. So they'll say it is a universal, so worldwide, international, withering of the state, no private property, everything is held in common. So it's so sort of distant and far off, so that you have to go through, advanced capitalism, you have to go through socialism, and the state has to wither away. That it's you can't even talk about it. It's so far away. and then there's also the sort of common use of the term, which is basically Marxist, Leninist, socialist, statalist states in the 20th century, which is, I mean, historically, it really has nothing to do with the word communism, even as Marxist Leninists use it. They would never call those states communist. So those two uses of the term have really kind of muddied the water. So I wanted to bring back the communism in terms of social relationships, because then it's something that you can actually talk about.
Right.
And
So, Roman, could I interrupt you there? So I think for a lot of people, this will be sort of very abstract. Can I ask you, your book gives a wealth of information about how early Christians lived in basically the first and second centuries, if I understand you correctly. Could you just informally for us kind of paint us a picture of, I'm an average, recent joiner of the Christ movement, and I'm in first century Palestine. How do I live? Just paint an informal portrait of what my relationships are like and my everyday kind of economic reality.
Right. So the first thing to understand is that joining these movements, they were based on the Jewish movement that came before it. So they were based around ecclesia, what they today would call the church. But it's not. You don't think of it in terms of a building. It's the word ecclesia actually just means like an assembly. So it's a congregation. So you join this group, this community, and basically you'd be through the teachings of this community through. And these are teachings that we have access to. We have them in the Gospels. We have them in the New Testament. We have them in the Apostolic Fathers, and they'd get.
Oh, hang on, you broke off for a second.
Towards their fellow Christians, and a material obligation. So basically, if their fellow Christian was in need, there'd be a very, very strong push for, if you have the ability to take care of that person or to fulfill that need, you kind of have to do it. And the other thing that they would do, and this is described in detail by Justin Martyr, where when they would gather together, when they would meet, they would take a collection, and everyone would give to this collection, to the presbyters, to the elders, and they'd gather all this stuff, and then they would distribute it to the widows, to the poor, to the orphans, to those in prison. And we know that this was not like a kind of philanthropy thing of, if you want to, you can give something, and over time they gather it up and give it to. This was something to where there was a daily distribution to the widows. So they would distribute food on a daily basis to the widows. So it was a very, very, very strong pressure to do that. And the way you could see that is they talk about sharing all things in common. Some of the early fathers, and they compare it with things like abstaining from fornication, from idolatry, things like that. So it would be, in order to not do that, to not take part in these relationships, to not take part in these redistributions, would be very serious. It would be almost like you're not being a Christian. It's like it would be like them, going back to serving one of the gods or whatever. So one way that I modeled it was on the Essenes. And the Essenes were a Jewish sect within the same time period who were very similar to the Christians. They existed before the Christians, and they were very well known. Josephus talks about the four sects being the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and then something called the fourth sect, which are also known as the Zealots. But the Essenes are very interesting because we have two sources for the Essenes. We have people like Philo and Josephus, who were Jews writing for Gentiles. for non-Jews. And that's the same sort of format that we have in Luke Acts, which is a Christian writing for the outside world. That's the most of the Gospels. It's or most of the New Testament, except for the letters, of course. But so we see how they use that language, how they talk about how the Essenes, and they use the exact same language. They hold all things in common.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can look at the Essenes, their own writings, and we have access to those through the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it's not exactly correct to say that the Dead Sea Scrolls community were the Essenes per se, because the Essenes, it's kind of like the word, conservative or liberal. It can be a group or it can be a tendency. So I think one scholar who focused on the Dead Sea Scrolls calls them Essene-ish. So these are a group that would be under the umbrella of Essenes. So we have their writings in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we have documents like the Damascus document, the Community Rule document, that describe how they organize themselves. And these are documents that they wrote for themselves. So we can compare the two and see how they were described to the outside world and how they describe themselves. And then we can sort of make a model and then compare that to the Christians. And with the Essenes, it was basically the same thing. They had a sort of formal collection distribution. They had a tax system that they would have to collect in money and then distribute. But they also had a very strong emphasis on sharing and informal communism. And I have to just talk about a distinction. In my book, I use a distinction between formal and informal communism. And the distinction is basically this. Formal communism is where the moral principle of from each according to his ability to each according to his need is enforced through a rule or some sort of regulation. So like a monastery would have rules to make sure that relationship continues. Informal communism would be more kind of like, if a disaster strikes, people spontaneously revert to communism. They just go out there and they find out who needs what. And or like, for example, when a bunch of friends are going on a trip together, very often they'll organize themselves communistically, just spontaneously. So those are the two ways that I use that term. And for the Essenes, they had both. And they were both very strong, to the point to where Josephus could describe them as having all things in common, not having, holding anything for themselves. Even though we know that they had in their own internal documents issues about, like, for example, let's say someone lost something that was their own. So we know that they hadn't sort of gotten rid of private property as a concept. They just had pushed it to the point to where it was almost, it was much less relevant than in the outside world.
Right. So let's say I'm an early Christian, and I mean, I'm sure there must have been cases where people said they didn't want to share, right? They didn't want to give, they didn't want to hold all things in common. Are there cases that you know of, or are there well-known cases where that was dealt with, and how was that dealt with?
Right after the second time the all things in common is described, you have the story of Ananias and Sapphira, and in that case, that's a little bit of a complicated story, because it's kind of like it's written in a way to remind you of a story in the Hebrew Bible in Joshua about someone who had hidden something that was meant to be for God. But the story basically is that these two, this couple, were going to join the Christian congregation. And they had said that they had sold their property and was going to distribute it, give it to the apostles for distribution. They gave part of it. They didn't give the rest of it. They got caught, and in the story, God smites them dead. Now, a lot of people will point to that story to say, well, okay, look, it shows that they had private property because, the apostles, Peter says to them, like, well, it was your property, before you sold it, so you didn't have to do it. But you're lying to us and the Holy Spirit and so on. And the thing is so they were expected to do that, and they didn't have to do it, in the sense that if they didn't do it, no one was gonna arrest them. But the idea was, if you're gonna be a Christian, this is something you have to do. So it would be kind of like this. Like, let's say you become a Christian, but you want to continue to give sacrifices to the local god where you are, because it's been helping your farming. Now, no one's gonna force you not to do that. You can do that if you want, but you're not being a Christian. It's just
Right.
not happening.
And so is it fair to say that probably to the degree that you lived by communism, you were a valued member of the Christian community, and you probably your status increased, the respect you earned increased, these sorts of things. Whereas if you didn't willingly hold all of your things in common, and if you weren't extremely generous and these sorts of things, then you were probably just ostracized a bit, or at least your rank in the community probably plummeted, right? So that's a kind of organic way that these sorts of norms could be enforced over time. Is that what happened?
So you see this in the New Testament, for example, with the book of James, and then you see it later on, more in late antiquity. So there's another book by a scholar called Peter Brown, who focuses on late antiquity, and there we have a lot more documentation. And there's discussions of they'd go into these meetings where they'd be gathering together, and they'd see rich people come in, and everyone would be watching them. And this, I can't remember exactly, but I think these were describing congregations in North Africa, and I can't remember exactly who was written that was describing it, because this is obviously in a later period that I'm describing. But the point is that they would come in, and automatically everyone would be watching them to make sure that they were giving according to what they had, and there was a lot of pressure there. We see in in James, for example, a lot of talking about the rich in very negative terms, and talking about how the rich for example, they don't deserve any special honor, and that their wealth is going to be, falling away, and all that thing. So you can see it all throughout the New Testament. Wealth, riches, and rich people, there was a very negative connotation. They were looked at as bad people, in a sense. You see it in the Gospels. One story is of the rich man who approaches Jesus, and he says, "You got to sell everything." And that was, in a sense, that was what is expected. If you're a wealthy person, that was you, in a sense, were, I don't want to say it's a lower position per se, but you had a lot more pressure on you to participate more so. Right.
It's sort of like what some social scientists call a reverse dominance hierarchy.
Yeah.
So, yeah. It's interesting. So, okay. So there are lots of things I want to ask you about, lots of directions we can go in from there. I think we've done a pretty good job so far of just painting the basic coordinates of what you mean by early Christian communism. One question that comes to mind is, do you know the book? I don't know if you cited it or not, but do you know the book by Reza Aslan?
Yeah, Zealots.
Yeah. Do you talk about that at all in the book, or
no?
Yeah. So I'm not a religious scholar, and I don't know what is influential or not. But I did read that book a couple years ago, and I'm not sure if he how well respected he is. I mean, I think he's like decently well respected, but he's been on he did the media round, so I'm not a scholar, so I don't know how legit it is.
So Reza Aslan. But first of all, before I say, I have to caveat something I said before. So when it comes to when I'm talking about how rich people were treated and all that stuff, there's a lot of stuff that we just don't know, and the best we can do is with the sources we have, the best reconstruction we can make. So just want to caveat that. So say that when I'm describing these sort of, social relationships and pressures and like the sort of systems of organization, what I have in my book, I'm pretty solid that I can stick by that and say that is pretty solid. But once I start going beyond that, I have to caveat it and just say we're working with limited sources, and we can't say for sure. As far as Reza Aslan, how do I don't want to. So when it comes to sort of New Testament scholarship and history of early Christianity, he would not be one of my go-to guys.
Wait, well, real quick, Roman, do you mind, just for our listeners, can I rehearse his argument real quick?
Go ahead.
So just people know what we're talking about and why I mentioned him. Because whatever religious scholars might say and whatever, bones you might pick with the book, if you're into radical politics and at all into Christianity, it's a pretty damn fun book to read.
Yeah, definitely.
Basically, and like I said, many caveats about how I don't know shit about the history of religion. So, and I'm not like a real Catholic, or very good one anyway.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah. So what he basically says in that book is, or at least the way that I read it, is that, in first century Palestine, one of the first things you have to realize is that there were all kinds of radical, basically kind of political, theological movements popping up all over the place. So like small sects of basically economic and political kind of rebels who were speaking out against, the inequality in Judea and Roman rule. And basically, I mean, it was a very common thing for like a small group of people, and especially like some sort of like charismatic leader, to preach a bunch of prophecies, condemning injustice, and then like trying to basically overthrow shit. Like it was a very volatile landscape, and this sort of thing was not uncommon at all. And actually, like, even when Jesus was crucified, he was probably crucified among a bunch of other people who were similarly crucified for basically similar kinds of treasonous activity. And so the picture that Reza Aslan paints, at least as far as I understood it, was that Jesus was kind of one of many kind of political revolutionaries. He's almost like an anarchist revolutionary is the way that he sounds in Reza Aslan's book. So now you can tell me, where you depart from that, or if you do or not, or whatever.
Right. So the thing is a lot of what he says is true. So most of what you like, basically all you said is more or less true, right? During that time, especially in Galilee, there were all kinds of revolutionary prophetic movements. I mean, one of the famous ones that I think is probably, if you want to understand Galilee, there's a guy called Judas the Galilean who did an uprising against the census, and the idea being that this is basically slavery. Submitting to the Roman census is no better than slavery. And there was that. There were other movements. There were movements that were not violent, but sort of prophetic. So, for example, there was one sort of prophet who was going to go to Jordan, and his promise was he was going to split the Jordan, and it was sort of a redoing of Moses and Joshua splitting the Jordan, or splitting the Red Sea, and it's a prophetic gesture, but it was so threatening to the Roman state that they sent in cavalry to basically kill him. So these prophetic movements and revolutionary movements were tied together, and they were widespread, and they built up eventually to 70 CE with the big Zealot uprising, where they took Jerusalem and the temple got destroyed. So one of his main points is basically uncontroversial in when you study early Christianity and the Second Temple Judaism, is that the modern distinction we make between politics, religion, economics, the society, those you can't apply those distinctions to the ancient world. So when these Jewish movements in Galilee, in Judea, in Samaria as well, when they had a political movement, it was almost always also religious. And when they have religious movements, they're almost always political. So Judas the Galilean, one of his things was that if you submit to the Roman census, you're going against God, and that you should obey God rather than men. You know, the early apostles said the same things when they were being arrested, that we have to obey God rather than men. And out of that came a revolution, an uprising in Galilee. Now, where I differ is that Jesus could be described in the same category as the Zealots, or that movement. Josephus calls it the fourth philosophy. And there's a couple reasons for that. First of all, it's that the Zealots were violent. In other words, they were a military movement. So their idea was they were going to sort of copy what the Maccabees did to the Seleucid Empire a couple centuries earlier, have a armed uprising, a military uprising, reestablish the kingdom by force, and then they would have, you know, God's favor. Jesus very specifically didn't do that, and he was very he was nonviolent, and Reza Aslan acknowledges that in his book. And not only that, but his movement was it was eschatological, meaning it was his idea was that God was going to come, intervene, and set things straight. And he had this kind of sort of kingdom of God coming to set things straight idea. And it was apocalyptic. So he used a lot of the imagery from, so for example, in the Gospels, when it talks about the Son of Man, that's apocalyptic imagery from the book of Daniel. It's also in, you know, the book of Enoch. And this is the idea of, it's an eschatological idea of this heavenly figure coming down and, putting things straight for God, setting up the kingdom of God. So that's what Jesus was about. Now, I don't really get so much into the historical Jesus stuff as the same way Reza Aslan does, but his idea of Jesus as kind of like a failed revolutionary, I don't think it fits unless you really, you open the category of zealot so wide to where it basically would include every prophetic movement. In that case, it would include the Essenes as well,
Okay, so you make a distinction between the more explicitly political revolutionary movements, such as the Zealots, from Jesus, who was more eschatological, you would say.
I would say that, but I wouldn't say it's any less political.
Right. It didn't have the express instrumental goal of changing the political landscape. It was a purely
basically the difference is for the Zealots, they got to do the dirty work. For Jesus, God's going to do the dirty work. That's basically the difference. So his idea of, now you have to remember, we live in modern times in a kind of disenchanted era, and so we think of in terms of like heaven. If you believe in God, if you're religious, there's heaven out there. That's its own different realm that, when you die or whatever, or sometime in the future, that's going to be relevant. And then there's the earth, which is the political, historical, material realm. And then you have the forces of history and politics. Back then, it wasn't like that. Back then, the view was like heaven and earth, using those terms very broadly, were intertwined. One scholar that makes that describes this very well is N.T. Wright, who describes basically how heaven and earth were always intersecting and clashing. So whenever they talk about in the New Testament, it talks about like the powers and principalities. Paul talks about that. And some people discuss, well, was he talking about, earthly, Caesar and the kings, or was he talking about sort of heavenly figure aeons, as they were called, like the divine, the gods, you could say, that were ruling over the different nations? And really, it's both, because those things were intertwined.
Right.
For
Right.
example, Augustus Caesar was called the Son of God. He was a divine figure, and for them, it's not metaphorical. He really is a divine figure. So,
Right.
so that's one distinction that I think we have to be careful to not sort of force anachronistically into the first century.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. No, that's really good. That's really useful. Roman, real quick, we have a comment from a viewer.
Yeah.
We don't have to respond to it, but if you want, I'll just throw it up. I'll throw it up there. If you have anything to add to it, you can. If we want to just keep going, that's cool too. But I feel like if people are going to write us questions, the least we can do is express them for them. So
yeah, sure.
Roger Hicks says that the ideals of communism, it seems to me, are rooted in human tribal nature, which evolved long before the first states and civilizations emerged from what must have been a very tribal environment. Yeah, so I guess what Roger's kind of getting at is that there's something very deep about communism that speaks to something almost hardwired in us as human beings.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that, but I'd say like some people, I don't think it's just a tribal thing. I think, I mean, communism exists today in everyday life as much as possible. In order to for communism, in a sense, to be suppressed. Now, this has nothing to do with the first, second century Christianity. This is just sort of my view of things.
Sure.
You basically need political forces of violence to suppress it, and one way to see that is you go back to the Middle Ages, and how did capitalism start? Well, you gotta shut down the commons. You got to do that. You got to force people away from the commons, not give them access to that, so that they have to go to the cities and start working, for the factories. You have to enforce strict private property laws in areas that were once, common to make that happen. You have to force commodification.
Right.
So in my idea, it's basically communism is just the way people naturally interact with each other if there's no sort of threat of violence going on.
Do you know Barbara Ehrenreich's book? Do you talk about that at all?
No.
The one, it's called Dancing in the Streets.
I've heard of that book, but I
haven't. It's not like about Christianity. I wouldn't necessarily expect you to know it or talk about it in your book. But there's a subsection in there somewhere about early Christianity. Actually, I think you'd find it.
Oh.
Yeah, I think you'd find it very interesting. And I remembered it, and actually this morning I was kind of reviewing it a little bit before this podcast because I was curious about remembering what she talks about. And so I'll kind of rehearse for you real quickly what she says about early Christianity, and you can let me know if it resonates with what you know about the period. But basically, if I understand her correctly, so her book is basically it's a history of collective joy, and so basically she's very interested in the history of kind of ecstatic ritual and all the different things that human beings have done throughout time to basically commune together in deeply bonding and pleasurable ways. And so, and basically her kind of hypothesis or kind of starting point for the book is that if you look over the course of human history, it sure seems like human beings used to do that sort of thing way more than they do now. And that especially in kind of ancient times, there were all kinds of ecstatic rituals and different forms of collective ecstasy, especially public collective ecstasy. And so her book is all about the history of basically, public forms of collective joy. And so she talks about early Christianity as a kind of adaptation of the Dionysian cults or the Bacchus cults.
Yeah.
And so the way she kind of tells the story is that in this kind of first century Palestine period that we're talking about. So I guess around the same time that people like Reza Aslan are describing all of these kind of radical theological, political upstart projects, there is also a very widespread culture of what you'd call ecstatic ritual. So different cults that basically engage in really kind of frenzied forms of dancing, sacrifice, eating and drinking, festivities in a kind of spiritualized way. And so the most famous kind of emblem of that is Dionysus, who's associated with wine. There were lots of little cults that worship Dionysus, and they were known for their very exuberant and indulgent rituals involving sex and women running out of the home to go into the woods and fling their clothes off and howl at the moon while they're drunk on wine and all these sorts of things. There were all different types of groups engaging in this sort of stuff, and so it was religious, it was ecstatic, and it had to do with basically things like dancing and eating in public in exuberant ways together. Okay, and so there was all that kind of stuff going on in the pre-Christian moment, often under the name of Dionysus or Bacchus or whatever. And what she argues is that stuff was seriously repressed by the Romans for the obvious reason that it's a major political threat. To have women running out of their houses and stuff like that into the woods to celebrate in frenzied orgies and things like that. So once it was repressed by the Romans, that she sees Christianity, and in particular the Christ figure, as a kind of adaptation to that problem. And she argues that basically before Christ, on the one hand there was Yahweh, and who was a kind of patriarchal, very militaristic, kind of stern, repressive type of spiritual figure. And then there were these like feminine ecstatic cults. But basically what she argues is that the Christ figure is kind of like a merging of kind of the harshness of Yahweh and the kind of patriarchal kind of control mechanisms associated with Yahweh, but also the feminine ecstatic rituals and that kind of ecstatic collective joyous tendency. She basically argues that Christ was kind of like a solution to squaring that kind of trade-off or something like that. And basically the final point I'll make is that is just the empirical one, where she marshals a lot of evidence to show that, just like you show, that the early Christians were essentially communists in their relationships and material organization. Well, she shows, or at least marshals a fair amount of evidence suggesting that in the 1st and 2nd century Palestine, the early Christian communities also prioritized all kinds of ecstatic rituals, eating, singing, dancing, often in rather extreme, quite exuberant ways, to the point that, over time, even St. Paul was kind of quoted here and there as needing to sort of repress it because it was getting out of hand. So I'm just curious if you know much about that and how it seems to directly feed into your argument about how these early Christians were communists. They also seem to be kind of exuberant, joyous, collective, celebrators also. I wonder what you think about that.
Well, so I'd have to look at her work specifically, but I'm hearing myself echo. Let's see. Okay, I think we're good now.
I can I'll mute the microphone. That might be.
Okay, so it's difficult to say without reading exactly what evidence she's showing, but I will say the thing with using the mystery cults, and Dionysus was one of these mystery cults, which were basically, around the time when Jesus came in the Roman Empire. There's a lot of evidence that people were becoming unsatisfied with the sort of traditional religious cult that existed, which were just the national gods, the city gods, and that these mystery cults were gaining a lot of popularity. And Dionysus was one of them. And you'd go in, you'd do some kind of initiation ritual. They were very secretive, and you'd have the sort of rituals that you were talking about, and there'd be different things that people would do. There'd be different sort of sacrifices and stuff like that. But I don't think that those should be the primary sort of background for describing early Christianity. And there's a couple of reasons. A lot of these mystery cults, it would be wrong to call them communities. These were not things that you were part of as a community. They were more, you could say, kind of like a club that you would go to. It's not a perfect parallel, but people would. So, for example, you could be part of one mystery cult, Dionysus cult. You could be part of another one, and then you could also, sacrifice at your local, national, temple or cultic rituals. So these weren't exactly communities in the same way that the Christian communities were, the ecclesias were. In my opinion, the best model for the ecclesias is the synagogues, the Jewish synagogue. And I think the best way to describe early Christianity is primarily through the Judean, Galilean, and diaspora Jewish communities. Now,
Okay.
There's no doubt that these mystery cults had a later effect on Christianity, and there is no doubt that there were certain sort of practices. So for example, there's in Paul's letters, he talks about that the women, it's seen very often as very patriarchal. Like the women have to be silent, the men are going to do the talking. And it's, as you said, in a lot of these, religious movements, these cults, it was very much the feminine. The women were the ones that would run the rituals, that would be the sort of the oracles and so on. And Paul was, in that sense, trying to avoid that practice coming in. Whatever you want to think about that. Another thing is, so for example, the Eucharist. Which we now know today as the little cracker and wine representing the blood and body of Christ, or if you're a Catholic, the blood and body of Christ. But that back then you had the Eucharist and the agape meal, which was a feast, and they had these large feasts. And we know Paul sort of said some things warning about people overeating, overdrinking. We know that later on. Some of the church fathers, I think it was Augustine, actually said that they should just stop that altogether because it's getting a little too wild. But I'm not sure I would jump on board with using the Dionysian mystery cults as sort of the framework for early Christianity. I do think that it grew organically out of Galilean and Judean Christianity. Now, as it spread outside to the diaspora, it was originally almost entirely Jewish, and what they called God-fearers, who were Gentiles who basically would join Christian communities as people who were sort of fans of the religion, and they weren't full Jews, but they would go to the synagogue. They respected the practices, and then it was after 70 CE, the destruction of Jerusalem, that there started to be a sort of rift between Judaism and Christianity. There actually started to be, a difference between people would be able to tell that, well, no, these are a special sect, the Christians. And then it was after 130 CE, the Bar Kokhba revolt, that it sort of became its own religion. And there's various reasons for that there really became the break after 130 CE, that the Christians distance themselves from the Jews and vice versa. But prior to that,
Okay.
it was prior to that, Christianity was basically one of the sects of Judaism, and that would be the main sort of way to reconstruct it. And I'm not saying that it would be inappropriate to look at the mystery cults and use them as parallels, but
Right.
just how much you'd be able to make out of that as a sort of direct connection, you'd have to be careful there, because just because there is a direct connection, in other words, there's a parallel, doesn't mean that you can make a causal connection. So
yeah, for sure. And I totally see how you're thinking about it. You're thinking about it as a kind of scholar of early Christianity and all these details. But I think for the average listener, it is really useful to think about early Christian communism with this sort of background because and I don't think Ehrenreich is overstating the case. I think she would probably agree with your qualifications. But I think what's interesting about it for maybe the average listener is that Christianity is often seen as this very stern, controlling kind
right,
of project, and also communism is often seen in a strangely similar way. It's associated with things like Stalin and everyone coming to steal your private property, and kind of the dour, socially controlling faces of contemporary activists who just want to police, your language and make you, make you pay more taxes, right?
right,
There's this sort of dourness that's associated with, I think, both Christianity and communism. But you read books like your book and Ehrenreich's book or Reza Aslan's book. You read all of these different types of books, and you get a few different angles on the moment of Jesus Christ and the Christian communities as you realize it's totally different, and like what is actually going on with this Christian idea and this Christian movement is almost impossible for modern people to understand because our kind of intuitions have been so conditioned and kind of demoralized really through through modernity and capitalism and all of these kinds of disciplining forces, that at the bottom of Christianity is this kind of insanely radical, rambunctious, revolutionary, ecstatic kind of vision of how people don't need to exploit each other, and people don't need to calculate, and people can just radically invest themselves in each other without instrumental, rational exploitation. And if everyone just has faith that will work, that it actually in the end does work. And yeah, so I mean, it's a kind of emotional revolution that is the opposite of dour in some ways.
Yeah, one thing that I think is important with early Christianity is to understand that what they were doing basically is they, as I said before, it was originally primarily an eschatological movement. So what they were doing was basically saying, okay, this is how the world will be with the eschaton. So we're going to live that now. We're going to build communities now that reflect that. So they were, in a sense, you could say, an internationalist movement. So they didn't, for example, they didn't join the military, and that got them in a lot of trouble. And they also, Paul makes a big point to sort of make sure that Christianity is universalist. So he would say, there's no Jew, no Gentile. He made a big deal that anyone can be part of Israel through faith, that anyone can sort of join the promises that God gave through Israel. So it was very internationalist. So it was one thing that I think is interesting about the guy who commented earlier about the tribal nature of communism. And that's definitely. But one thing that Christianity was doing was trying to make a sort of universal tribe, right? Where what bound people together was not sort of like ethnic or national identities, but this faith that they had in Christ, and that they were dedicated to the message of the kingdom of God. Another thing that I think is important to remember is that when they were building these communities, it was not about individual salvation in the sense. And there's a lot of modern scholarship on rethinking Paul's theology. E.P. Sanders, I think James Dunn also contributes to this. N.T. Wright, it's called the New Perspective on Paul, which is that he is basically should be seen not as sort of departing from Judaism, but as a continuation of it, and that his idea of salvation is not individual but corporate, that it's the community, the group, the sort of new people of God that get saved. So it was a community movement. And, when people talk about it being, restrictive or something like that, I mean, you have to, it depends what you're comparing it to, and it depends what exactly you're talking about. So, of course, there were, things that the Christians were promoting or doing that, modern people might think of as restrictive. But again, the way you have to look at these movements is from the standpoint of their own time period and how they would be seen by the people of their own time period. There's many different sort of apologias, which is, a sort of defense of the faith by the Christians. And one of them is Diognetus, an epistle to Diognetus. And then later on, you have, again, Justin Martyr to try and other ones. And they would write to non-Christians and even to, emperors to try and say who they were and to try and stop persecution against the Christians. And what I think is interesting about those letters is just to show how afraid the authorities were of groups like this, and how these groups were desperately trying to say, look, we're not trying to destroy society as you think we are. And so it is, I think it's interesting to think about what made groups like this such a threat.
So
one thing that's interesting, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. No, go on. I didn't mean to cut you off. I was going to ask a question when done.
I was just going to add one more thing, that during that time period, there were rumors going around that Christians were, incestuous, that they were cannibals, like these crazy rumors that would go around, and there would be all kinds of other threats. So, for example, there was a guy called Celsus who wrote this big book against the Christians, and he basically said that the Christians are destroying society, and that that by their abandoning of the gods, they were basically deviants who were anti-society. So it's important to look at what the Christians were in their own world and see how people in that world viewed them. So that's what I wanted to say there.
Okay, yeah, no, that's a great point. Something that I was thinking about is there is this kind of common objection to communism, and that I want to kind of think about, because one of the things that I find most interesting and cool about your book is that when you look at how the early Christian communists were, how the early Christians were communists, what you realize is that in at least this one way, communism does work. It can work. I mean, the overwhelming kind of problem with the way people see communism today is like it's just seen as an absurdly stupid political philosophy or program, because it simply can't work. Everywhere it's ever been tried, it doesn't work. And there is a tremendous amount of empirical support for that view, that communism doesn't work, it can't work. But if you look at the early Christians, it actually can work in this peculiar sort of way. And so that's why I think your book is really important and valuable and interesting, because if you're interested in communism, you really have to understand the early Christians. You have to think real hard about why communism seems uniquely sustainable in this kind of unique spiritual framework. And so what I'm really after, one of the things I'm really trying to extract from this conversation more than anything else, is trying to figure out what exactly is it that somehow, like, what was the unique Christian solution that made communism workable, as not just in small groups, but as you say, as a universalist project that actually had imminently expanding and increasingly powerful kind of geopolitical effectiveness and reality to it. So yeah, I have a few kind of specific subpoints I kind of want to go into on that, but that's my kind of
I wanted to say one
quick
thing
general question.
in between is that in a sense these communities were kind of small scale, but one of the very first sort of international actions of the Christian movement was a international redistribution of goods. Paul would go around. That was one of his big missions, was going around to the different communities in places like Asia Minor and Greece to collect funds for Jerusalem, were in that area there was a famine. So he was collecting funds. So there was an international redistribution going on. So it's not just like, oh, it only works small scale. Well, no. Very early on, there was an international redistribution going on. And when people say that communism doesn't work, to me, what they're really saying is Leninism applied in the 20th century doesn't work. And okay. And then again, it depends what you mean by works. And, yeah, there's a lot of problems with that model, and I would not recommend it. But, generally when they say communism doesn't work, they always go back to certain presuppositions about human nature that are empirically just untrue. So a lot of times they'll go back to saying, they'll basically assume the Homo economicus model, which is, well, of course, people want to, maximize their own gain. So people are selfish. So if you have if there is some sort of communism, everyone will take advantage of it. And then, the tragedy of the commons, that example. But we know through sort of psychological studies, anthropological studies, sociology, that Homo economicus is a completely bunk idea. That's not how humans function. That's never how humans functioned. In fact, to get people to function that way, you have to have a lot of institutional forces to force that to happen. People just generally they're not like that. Humans are naturally social, and they naturally care about recognition more so than personal gain. So that's why you have the tragedy of the commons, this concept. But then when you actually read some anthropology about pre-state societies, you don't really have that same problem. People are not acting in the Homo economicus model. And the same goes with private property. I mean, private property is a state institution. It's just like governments are. There is no state of nature, axiomatic necessity for private property. I think this all goes back to John Locke and some sort of, in my view, fundamental mistakes he made that sort of have bled out into the whole sort of liberal market way of looking at the world, which ends up making people say that communism is impossible and that capitalism is just the way humans normally act and it's inevitable.
So someone named Zach Palmer just wrote something on the YouTube stream saying, bringing up a good point. He mentions Badiou. Are you familiar with Badiou at all?
Yeah. I quote him in my book.
Yeah, so do you know? Have you? Oh, okay, he's in there. I wasn't sure if he was in there. So you're familiar with on St. Paul?
Yeah, I haven't read it, but I know the sort of the interest in Paul among continental philosophers, left-wing continental philosophers, Zizek, Badiou, and a lot of those guys I know have recently been very interested in Paul.
Yeah.
and theology.
Yeah. So extremely well versed in Badiou, or specifically, I haven't read his book at all, the book on St. Paul, that is. But Zach mentions the point that, yeah, Badiou traces the communist universal subject back to St. Paul. And so I can definitely see that argument. I don't, but I guess neither of us are very well versed on it, so we can't say too much about it.
Yeah. No, I haven't read his book, so I can't. I've read his book on love, which I really like, and I recommend it. But I haven't read his book on Paul.
Yeah, I've read a few of his books too, and I think he's brilliant, but for the most part. But yeah, I can't comment on the Paul idea too much. Although, I mean, what I can say is that it seems obvious, not obvious, but it does seem undeniable to me that the history of modern communism as a political movement, as a political philosophy, also draws heavily on basically Christian foundations. Although obviously
you went out for a second there. I didn't hear the last thing you said. You said modern communism. And
sorry,
I lost the audio.
Sure. Yeah. Sorry about that. No worries. I was just saying that it seems quite clear that modern communism as a movement and as a philosophy is drawing on Christian foundations in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Right. But obviously, religion at a certain point after the scientific revolution, religion becomes, a real kind of marketing problem. It's not very good for PR if you're like still talking about God after a certain point. So I think like Marx is very keen to try to lay everything out in scientific terms, but I think it's pretty obvious that you kind of don't get modern communism without drawing on kind of implicit Christian foundations. Like I am familiar with Walter Benjamin's writings on this question a little bit. I'm sure you're familiar with, his notion of what he calls weak messianism, that Marxism is, highly eschatological in obvious ways, and that it's even messianic in a certain way.
Yeah. Now this is this is one problem that I have with a lot of the sort of new interest that a lot of the secular left has in theology. Not that I have a problem that they have an interest. I think it's great. I wish more people had an interest in Christianity and theology. But I do think that, like, okay, one really good example of this is Slavoj Žižek, and a lot of people love or hate him. But his main interest in theology, and he's written books with a lot of quite prominent theologians, is he wants to have a secular theology, a atheist materialist theology, and and that's like what you said, and what's a lot of people have noticed, that the modern communist movement has very, very easy to see Christian eschatological roots, messianist roots, but it's secularized. And my own opinion is it just doesn't work. I think that that ultimately secularism, atheism, is the religion of capitalism, and it's David Bentley Hart basically says that secularism, that capitalism is basically and secularism go hand in hand, and because the fundamental assumptions that capitalism relies on are very secular. And I would say that in Nietzschean worldview, a sort of nihilistic Nietzschean worldview fits a lot better with the idea of having a capitalist competitive market where you put everyone at each other's throats, that the entire point is to maximize profit, and you have things to enforce that, to make sure that that's how the economy is running. And that fits just much better with a secular worldview. And I think ultimately, Marx, and again, I'm not the only, there's been a lot of people that have noticed this. That Marx, Terry Eagleton is another person who makes this point a lot. That Marx was a lot less materialist than a lot of people kind of make him out to be. I mean, any time where you have a ideology where you're trying to describe this is what should be the case, this is the society that should be the case, where the assumption is automatic sort of human dignity from the beginning, and it is saying that every person has human dignity irregardless of what their position is in life or irregardless of what power they can muster, and that this society should run on that basic assumption, you're already in Christianity at that point, because Christianity was one of the, as far as I know, the movement that made that assumption foundational. In ancient Rome and in ancient Greece, the idea of a sort of universal fundamental dignity of mankind, of every person, it just wasn't there. I mean, people try and find it in the Stoics or whatever, but if you read them carefully, it's just not there.
Okay, that's a really good place to pause. I want to ask you about that then, because I'm very what you said. Real quick, do you know much about the other world religions, or no, not really?
Not to where I could say anything with any authority.
But
I mean, I know
what you just said
vaguely.
So what you just said, you think that Christianity is unique in some regard, with the emphasis it places on the absolute dignity of all beings. I'm curious, and if you just don't know, that's fine. But I'm curious, like, if the other world religions have that tenet also, or to a less degree.
Well, here's what I would say. There are other people who have sort of done more work on this, on how the ideas within Christianity were sort of seminal in sort of liberal and even socialist values that came after it. But for example, the whole idea of the Christ, the Messiah, which is in Mark, for example, Jesus is basically described as a kind of anti-Caesar. He's a reverse Caesar. He is, like Caesar, the Son of God. In fact, the good news of the Son of God, that was a title for that was a how do you say, a sort of a slogan for the emperor. Augustus was the Son of God, and when he became the emperor, he was the savior. So they would go around and talk about Augustus, the savior, the Son of God. And that's what Jesus was. He was sort of like portrayed in these sort of imperial this imperial title, and he would do things like ride in Jerusalem on a donkey, clearly sort of being portrayed as a sort of king. But he was the anti-king. He was this poor peasant who was of no one of any importance. His apostles were also a bunch of peasants, and he ended up getting executed by the state in the worst possible way, as a slave would get executed. And so this sort of Christian idea of taking the lowest and raising it to the highest in terms of dignity, that the executed, tortured peasant, that is the Messiah, the ruler of the world. I think that idea, along with ideas that come from Judaism, and so Judaism has a very, very strong what you could broadly call sort of social justice tradition, in terms of, caring for the poor, caring for the widow. The Mosaic law was unique in the early Near Eastern, the ancient Near Eastern laws, in that it had specific command that the outsider, the sojourner, should be treated the same way as an Israelite. So Christianity took that and then added this whole, the idea of the Messiah as this sort of suffering peasant. And I think that idea, along with the idea of sort of the God of history, which is different, as I understand it, from, say, some of the Eastern traditions. Now, I could be completely out of line here. I don't know much about the Eastern traditions, but as I understand it, they don't have a sort of God of history. They don't who is directing history to a specific end, or who has, in other words, in those Eastern religions, they're not eschatological, as far as I understand them.
Right.
I know.
Okay. So, go ahead.
Yeah. So, and the other thing is that Christianity inherited from Judaism a very a collective identity, that it was, it's love God and love your neighbor, and the love your neighbor is just as much part of it. So this idea of koinonia, fellowship, which is that each person has an absolute obligation, primordial obligation to his fellow, prior to any sort of contract or anything that they have, that obligation is there from the beginning. That is something that is in the Christian tradition. Now, as far as the Eastern religions, I can't say, but I can say that when it comes to the Greco-Roman religions, and the religions that Christianity was competing with in that time period, it was completely unique in that sense, in right. the other sort of options, as it were, during that time period.
Right. So I want to go back to something you said before, when you were saying that it's now kind of fashionable for kind of radical lefty continental philosophers to try and kind of reclaim a certain kind of theology, but in a way that's ultimately secular, and how you think that just doesn't work. I think we can talk about this for a little while now, because I basically totally agree. And what I'll kind of just share with you the view that I've been coming to recently, and I'll be curious to hear what you think about it. But basically, so I've been involved in radical politics for since Occupy, since about 2011 is when I got really into radical left wing kind of thought and activity and stuff like that. And so since 2011, I've been involved in a bunch of radical left groups, and really, for quite a while was pretty passionate about trying to let's figure out how to overthrow capitalism. Let's really try to do it. I was really jazzed on it, and I had the enthusiasm that Occupy was able to give us, because we had actually something that was going on that was really live and it was exciting. So I had that kind of real active personal enthusiasm and confidence that comes from being immersed in an actual kind of somewhat insurrectionary moment. And so for 6 years after that, really, I was really, a deep belief I had that actually human beings, I really do think that human beings can fundamentally change the current state of the world in fundamental ways. I deeply believe it's within our ability to do it, and that we are ethically obligated to do it. But I was raised Catholic, but I've never practiced really ever since I got my confirmation when I was 14. I kind of fell away from it, and would never say that I'm, I would basically say I'm an atheist for most of my life, is what I would always say. So with that as context, what happened with me was that in all of the kind of radical activist groups that I was a part of, in kind of the incessant failures and the ultimate futility of everything that we ever tried to do, I always kind of sensed that there was something foundationally wrong. There was something just basically on a very basic level that was rotten. There was something not quite there, and that even more, a little bit more sinisterly, there were certain kind of false or disingenuous or maybe even bad faith kind of premises that I really have long felt to be one of the real causes of why the radical left is basically useless and impotent and completely unable to change the world in the ways that it claims to want to. And the short of it is that over the past couple of years, I've really been starting to think that religion has something to do with it, or really more generally, the question of rationality and and how we think about those things or don't think about them. And so I'll just try to spell out a little bit more detail what I have in mind here, because I think it's basically exactly what you were saying in some degree. I suspect from what you were saying before, you're going to agree with this, but maybe you'll disagree in interesting ways. But basically, I'm coming to the view nowadays that you simply cannot have a revolutionary political project, let alone movement, without some basic foundation that is ultimately, on some level, religious. And that if you try to have a radical political project, even a simple one, but certainly anything that pretends to be, committed to changing, the fundamental tenets of the status quo political order. Like if you're interested in doing that, and you're also committed to not being religious, what you're going to get in the end is a project that is itself, like you said, basically a kind of capitalist religion that is going to sneak in the back door, whether you like it or not. I really like what you said, that like secularism is the religion of capitalism. I think that's absolutely right. Like if you think that you're an atheist or an agnostic, but you want to support revolutionary politics and try and overthrow capitalism or something like that, it's inevitable that what you're basically going to become a devotee of the religion of secularism, which is basically going to keep you always locked into capitalist modes of behavior. And so that's what I think. I haven't really solved what to do next, but I'm curious if that resonates with you.
It completely does. So the reason I say secularism is kind of like the religion of capitalism is that the underlying, now secularism is a broad term, but the underlying idea is that there is no higher fundamental sort of moral law, and that each person basically has to choose for himself what the moral obligations he has and what moral obligations he doesn't have. He basically creates his own worldview, framework, and everything, and that there is no higher one. That's secularism. That when you say that there is, if you're going to go out there and say there is no God, we live in a material universe, that's it. Well, then any moral obligation that someone has to someone else is completely going to be self-generated or contractual. And I'm sure there's other ways that could happen. I mean, there could be just sort of like social pressures and so on that create some sort of obligation. But ultimately, the ideology is that it has to be self-driven from yourself, or it's not there. And basically the result of that is when you have capitalism. The idea of capitalism, especially modern day capitalism, is everyone is an entrepreneur. Everyone is their own capitalist. So the worker is just trying to get the most for himself. He's trying to build his own wealth so he can participate in the market. Everyone's entering these contracts with one another. There's no obligation. It has to be for self-interest. And there's this idea that you know, because capitalism commodifies everything. It turns everything into something which is to be bought and sold in the market, and it has to keep doing that in order to keep growing, right? So, you know, and this goes into a little bit of economics, but you know, profitability, return on investment has to continue to happen. So they have to find new ways to turn some things into commodities, which means something that people create to sell to maximize their own profit. And that's completely in line with the idea of secularism, that there is no higher sort of moral law. Now, there's a lot of secular people who would not say that. That they'd say, well, there is, you know, morality, but there's really any morality that they say that any obligation that someone has, the only way that they can sort of build a foundation for that is actually, I don't think there is any way. They just have to say that's just the way it is. So when it comes to sort of, you know, the secular, you know, left-wing politics, I think there's a lot of things wrong. So take a lot of protest movements. I think a lot of protest movements are very often, now I'm not saying that they don't do good. Very often they have very positive outcomes and they actually do accomplish things. But a lot of times it's sort of more a way to show your own that you've taken a stand and that you disapprove of something. You're not so much creating something new. You're just saying, I disagree with this thing that's happening there from the, you know, the moral framework that I've constructed for myself. This is wrong, what you guys are doing. But I always think, for me, I think the best way, if you have a problem with capitalism and you don't like it, the best way, or at least one good way, is to think in terms of what things are commodified and what things aren't. I think two of the best institutions that sort of give a living alternative to capitalism are things like public parks and libraries. I mean, if you think about the logic
and family
of a
family
public park
too, I think.
or the logic of a library, it completely just throws away the underlying ideologies of capitalism. You know, the idea that, you know, in a library you could go in and borrow a book, which is maybe expensive, it may be an expensive scholarly book, and people are going to do that all the time, and then return it and get a new one. You have this sort of common institution. Now, it's a small thing, right? A library. This is not threatening capitalism. The same thing with public parks. You go to a public park and you can, you know, take your family out for free. You know, you're not paying for it. You can go to where they have the bars and you can work out for free. No one's paying for it, you know, and yet it works, right? I mean, there's so many examples of this. I mean, of just things in the world now. So I think the way that people could be thinking, at least this is the way I think. I think, like, what things can I do to de-commodify aspects of my life to where I'm relying less on capitalism and more on, you know, social networks. And I don't mean like online social networks. I mean physical people who feel a sense of obligation to one another. Now, the thing with libraries and parks is that they, you know, they are within the sort of government system, and there are some kind of, you know, regulations, that there's property laws, stuff like that. But I think that, you know, building communities from which commodification is gone. There's no money changing hands. There's no, you know, market relationships like what the early Christians did. You know, they basically had these communities where the institution of patronage, which was a big institution back then. You could say it was like an ideology, very much like capitalism is the ideology now. They basically banished patronage, and as well as sort of like market thinking from their communities. So I think, a lot of people, think in terms of let's make these big changes to state structures. But if you think about how capitalism is developing, it's not necessarily changing the big political structures per se. It's slowly commodifying more and more of life, and that's how
Right.
capitalism's taken over.
So it's sort of an implication of what we're saying, that the current kind of activist left could potentially like create genuine kind of world historical anti-capitalist waves in a way that it currently isn't, but it would have to update its attitudes towards, I guess, like something like faith, right? Like I don't think either of us, like, is that fair to say? I mean, I don't, like, I'm not even proper.
Look, for me, I think look, I think if you don't have a belief in some sort of capital G God or divinity, where you are kind of saying that these obligations, these sort of moral imperatives, this sort of worldview that I am not the most important thing, but there is something bigger than me, and it's not something that I choose necessarily. It just is more important than me, whether I like it or not. I mean, that's, in a sense, you could say that that's one way to describe faith. I think that once you acknowledge that, which I think ultimately, I mean, even secular people very often acknowledge that in their lives. They live very often as though there is a God. They have these overarching moral worldviews that they don't necessarily choose, but that in a sense they're that they feel compelled to follow. So I think that just for me, I think that as long as the secular ideology, which is basically that there is no higher ultimate purpose, teleology, morality, as long as that is dominant, I think it's going to be very difficult to sort of push against the things that I think follow from that. And I think one of those things is, capitalism. There's a book, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Charles Taylor's A Secular Age.
Not that one, but yeah, I know his shtick a little bit.
Yeah, so I think he makes a pretty good case of how secularism developed, and how the sort of the creation of the idea of the individual as a sort of as the locus, the beginning point. And I think this is a big thing with John Locke as well, and a lot of the sort of state of nature guys. So that John Locke was basically working within a Enlightenment, disenchanted sort of. It wasn't quite yet. It wasn't secular like today, but it was a disenchanted world. And he had this sort of idea of the atomized individual, and that's where society starts. And I would want to say that no, the reality is not that the atomized individual meets together with other atomized individual and they create a society, but rather that the society creates the individual. I mean, you are who you are really only because of the people around you. I mean, you are not just a product of your society, but even the categories in which you think are social. And I would want to say that it's not just that the individual is a product of society, but that you know, the Judeo-Christian notion of the image of God, the Imago Dei, is I think very important, because there's a automatic assumption in at least Western thinking that there is something uniquely important about humans and human flourishing, and not just human flourishing, but like human dignity, and that this thing is central. And I want to say that when you get away from the atomized thinking of human individuals being these sort of atomic, independent creatures that start out with no obligations, no social relationships, and rather go that human beings are intrinsically embedded within a create our sort of political institutions, but also an ideology, which is the sort of liberal ideology of an atomized individual, of of a contractual nature of relationships and things like that. And I think what faith does is basically say, well, no, there's not the atomized individual. There's something above that means that we have primordial obligations that are prior to our own contracts, our own sort of
yeah, you know what else?
individual whims or desires.
Yeah, totally. And you know what else though? Like, even it's kind of mundane, but I think it makes a lot of sense if you think about it. If you're an anti-capitalist today,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just think about that for a second. Capitalism has never been so dominant as a kind of global economic super force that, you know, if today if you're literally going to say to people you're opposed to capitalism and you're going to try to get together with other people to overthrow capitalism, like, how could you not on some level have like be operating on faith? Like, you're sure as hell not operating on like a rational calculation of competing forces. Like, if you genuinely believe, if you're genuinely an anti-capitalist today, you kind of almost by definition have to be operating on some amount of faith, I think. And so, like, I don't think it's that much of a stretch to kind of take this next step that I'm kind of, you know, thinking about as I listen to you, which is that, like, if you really want to overthrow capitalism, you need to be a little bit more honest about how you're able to justify your claims about like the deserving equality of all people, because I think you're right. Like, the only way you can really found that or justify that is on some philosophy of radical absolute dignity, an equal dignity of all people, and there's no way to base that on like science or empirical evidence. I mean, maybe there is, actually, now that I think about it, but that, I don't know. I'm sympathetic to kind of what I think you were saying before, that ultimately, if your attitude towards you know, our, you know, the human condition, call it whatever you want, our kind of placement in the world, if your attitude towards it is secular or secularism, then you can basically forget about the idea of fundamentally transforming capitalism. I just think that what's the irony is that if you're an activist today, like a radical activist today, you are essentially a religious actor. Like, but since you deny God and you deny faith, it ends up actually, like, modern leftism ends up being a religion of itself. Like, you kind of end up worshiping yourself and your ideals,
Right.
and your community in this kind of like perverted, disingenuous way. And I think that's ultimately why modern radical activism like doesn't work at all, even though it's essentially as faith-based as any religion, but it's kind of doomed to fail because it's a bad faith religion or something like that.
I would say that I mean I use the term secularism, and really what I mean by that is sort of like the modern materialist kind of liberal worldview. But I would say that secularism, in terms of a pure secularism, a pure desacralized society, I would say it's completely impossible, because you're going to sacralize something. I mean, in modern capitalist societies, even though in theory they're secular in the sense that like in capitalism there is no value other than market value, right? There is no good other than what is profitable. So it doesn't matter. So for example, if I'm a nurse and I'm helping sick people and I'm producing a certain amount of profits, that's, I suppose that's good because I'm producing a certain amount of profits. But let's say I'm selling, opiates as medicine, and I'm getting people addicted to opiates, and I'm making a lot of profits. Hey, by objective measures in capitalism, I'm actually doing better. This is by definition better because it's measured by profit. So in capitalism, what's sacralized is profits, property. I mean, you can see this in the way people talk about markets, property, and profits. People talk about private property as though it were a primordial sacred right. So like if me and you are on an island together, like that, there would already be property lines established there, rather than we'd be together and trying to figure out how to survive on this island. That's how it's seen. And the same thing with markets. The markets are right by definition. So very often we'll take a market outcome, right? So like let's take pornography, for example. Now, people can argue, does pornography have negative effects on men or on marriages, whatever? But really, it doesn't matter, because there's a market interaction going on. And by definition, if it competes in the market and wins, it's good. The same thing with profits, that profits are automatically good. And the faith is that these markets will always lead to the best outcome, and that these markets are primordial, that they are beyond sort of human construct. It's kind of like the divine right of kings that they're used to have, in the old monarchies in Europe, that being a king was not a sort of societal arrangement, that this was a primordial sacred right. And the same thing with markets. I mean, as David Graeber and other anthropologists have found out, that markets are really a modern invention. People before states, before money, they didn't barter. There weren't markets. And one obvious way to see that is the problem of double needs. That in tribal societies, if I had chickens and you had cows, it's not like I would go up to you if I needed milk and give you eggs in exchange for milk. Because what if you didn't want the eggs? What would usually happen is there'd be some sort of we'd be lending to each other, giving, gift exchange, or just sharing. But in the way the modern capitalist ideology works, these things are sacred. In other words, the fact that that markets and property are not sort of primordial truths almost doesn't matter, because these are sacred categories. So all the discourse starts with that. And the same goes with sort of secularism. The idea that there is no ultimate value above what a person can come up with himself or what he can agree on with other people is just sort of axiomatic. in the way people think. But there's no, I mean, people don't argue for this position. It's just assumed. So I think that, man, I forget where I was going with this. But the idea of a sort of sacred, not sacred, but a secular, completely desacralized society is completely impossible. And what very often the left will do, and I don't like talking in terms of the left as a broad brush, but some people in the left, what many people do, is they accept the kind of the sort of liberal modern axioms which brought rise to capitalism, and then they try and sort of oppose capitalism within that framework. And it's I just think you're going to end up, you know, it's very difficult to do that. You're going to end up sacralizing something else, and unless you're aware of that this is how things work, you're not going to really you're going to end up getting problems that you didn't anticipate. I mean, this happened in, you know, the Soviet Union as well. I mean, I don't know that much about the history of the Soviet Union, but some things I've read is about how the Soviet government would mimic in many ways the old Tsarist regimes, and they kind of just made a Soviet version of that of the Tsarist regimes they replaced.
I think you're totally right. I mean, have you? By the way, we're on the better part of 2 hours, so I'm sure you're probably starting to run out of steam, as I am. So we can kind of move towards wrapping it up. But one thing I just wanted to say on that point, and this could be the last one actually, if you want, unless there are any final thoughts you want to add, by all means, take your time. But you know, you were saying that you think like it's just you're going to end up sacralizing something. And that jives well with something I said, I think, earlier in the conversation, which is that because activists, you know, especially kind of radical anti-capitalist activists, because they're not willing to kind of take the leap and explicitly kind of acknowledge the essentially kind of faith-based prospect that revolutionary social change essentially involves, that what ends up happening is that they end up kind of worshiping their own ideals in some sense. And you see this in very strange ways. Like, so what I was going to ask you was, I think we said we talked previously a little bit, and you said, I think, that you've always kind of been sympathetic to radical left ideas, but you're not an activist or anything, or you've not been you've never really been that involved in like activist work. Is that fair to say? Or
yeah, what? not really. Not, I mean, no. Right. I wouldn't call myself an activist. So,
right. I mean, you'd probably be very interested to see what kind of goes on like under the hood of radical left, like activist culture, because I could see ample evidence for the kinds of things we're talking about. Like, for what I see in my experience is, I mean, one example is sort of, it's not a concrete example, but it's like a stylized situation I'll give you, is something that I used to always realize is there's this kind of deep resistance to being like empirically serious about whether or not the work you're doing is succeeding or failing, whether it's working or not, you know? And so it's like, if you like rock up to like an anti-capitalist like activist meeting, and you try to kind of do work with people, and you're on some campaigns or projects or whatever, and you know, after a couple weeks, you're kind of like, you go to a meeting and you're like, hey guys, listen, I've been thinking about what we're doing. I've been looking at, you know, the causes and effects and how, you know, how our work seems to be proceeding, and it just seems to me that what we're doing is not going to overthrow capitalism. Like, it's just not, it's not really working out. And we need to really kind of like go back to the drawing board and really think more and seriously about like, what can human beings actually do to fundamentally challenge dominant economic system, you know? You get this kind of like, everyone's like, yeah, okay, we agree, but like we don't really know, so we just have to have faith that what we're doing is going to work if we just keep doing it. You know, they won't use the word faith, of course, but that is essentially like without a religious vocabulary, they'll basically look you in the eye and basically say, yeah, your critiques might be right. Maybe this isn't working, but just keep doing it, and let's just hope that we'll get more people involved. Things are going to change, and it's going to work eventually. And so I see this very clearly in activist culture. It's essentially it really is like religion coming through the back door, but it's not having faith in a higher ideal. It's not having faith in like a higher value or an afterlife or anything like that.
It's in a method.
It's like a faith in yourself and your group in some sense. And like, what is more sad than that? But not just sad, ultimately, like it's doomed to failure if what you have faith in is like your own beliefs, because that's the exact opposite of how you update your models and figure out how to like change things. Do you know what I mean? And so it's like, I don't mean to be like ragging on like the quote unquote left, which is like such an annoying thing always. But I'm just saying, I'm trying to kind of give like a concrete illustration of how religion will kind of always creep in the back door. And if you're not explicit about it and do it in like a noble, elevated, like beautiful and effective, honest way, then it's going to just be dishonest, and it's going to be it's going to be like absolutely opposed to your own kind of success in doing the things that you want to do on the world.
Right. I would say, I think so. So if we go back to sort of early Christianity, now, I mean, Christianity eventually became sort of the religion of the Roman Empire. And, that was certainly a mixed bag. I think when that happened, it was terrible for Christianity, but kind of good for the social situation of many people in the empire. So after Christianity became really big in late antiquity, things like hospitals showed up for the poor. Social programs started for the poor. Universal education. Things now. Slavery, for example, started to decline rapidly for various reasons. I'm not going to say that after Christianity took over the Roman Empire, everything was great, but there were serious effects that happened that had on society that ultimately led to, I think, many good things in the modern era. The idea of like the universal dignity of man, the idea that the poorest person has just as much dignity as anyone else, and that society is responsible for that person. That comes from Christianity. Now, Christianity never intended to take over the Roman Empire. What Christianity was doing was originally just setting out to sort of build its own communities using its own ideals, and basically their idea of their relationship to the Roman Empire was just leave us alone. That's basically it. They just didn't want to be, killed or thrown in prison. And, there were time periods where there was more persecution and time periods where there were less. But they had this eschatological worldview. They had the figure of the Christ. They had these teachings that come out of, Jesus's teachings, things that had to do with, for example, the Jewish notion of the Jubilee, the idea of the sort of, social reversal of the rich and the poor that came out of Judaism and the Christians took on. And ultimately, their goal was just to build these communities that were proponents of what they saw was the kingdom of God. And that's what they were building. And ultimately, I mean, if you look at the effect that it had a huge effect, even on the Roman state itself. So I think, I think what can make a big difference is people like let's take also take the example of capitalism. Capitalism didn't overtake feudalism through like some revolution or anything like that. You had the different revolutions here and there, but ultimately it was a change in ideology, a change in the dynamics, and that ultimately led to the creation of capitalism. So I think going back to a fundamental worldview standpoint and really thinking about what the fundamental basis of your worldview is, and what you're trying to get out of it, and what ultimately is your foundation for how you view the world, how you view society, how you view your place in it. I think that's something that people who have a problem with capitalism need to do, because if you don't do that, if you don't check your foundations, your foundational worldview, and really think deeply about how you think that morality works, value works, your metaphysical worldview, then you're going to end up approaching it with unexamined assumptions that will, that won't be helpful for you. And you mentioned that a lot of these activist circles, they have this sort of faith that sort of crept in, and I think the problem with it is not so much the faith itself, is that it's not examined and it doesn't have any foundation. They haven't thought about why they think what they think, why they have this faith, and what this is ultimately based on. It's just there. I mean, people have I think a lot of radicals, it ultimately comes from a deep ethical sense of an obligation, and then they just go after that. But they don't, not everyone examines where that deep sense of ethical obligation comes from, what its foundation is, and what and what worldview one has to adopt to make sense of that. And I think that's fundamental. If you don't do that, you're going to end up just sort of running after the wind, you could say, in my opinion. And I think that's what a lot of people are doing, is they're just running after the wind because they haven't thought hard enough about what they believe, why, and what their worldview is, and how that shapes their own obligations.
Dude,
I'm kind of repeating myself.
I think no, man, that was awesome. I think that's as good a closing word as I could come up with. So I think I'll let you have that as the last word. Unless there's anything else you wanted to sneak into the conversation before we wrap it up.
No, I mean that's fine. It went way off the original subject, which was my book and early Christianity and New Testament. But it was fun. I really enjoyed talking about these things, and I think these conversations are important, and that these are things that more people should be thinking about. I think Christians, people who are believers, like I am, should be thinking a lot more about what these texts that they venerate are actually saying, and should not just sort of, skip over to the personal salvation text and think, well, I'm good. They should really take what it's saying seriously and take the ethical implications seriously. And I think they should study early Christian history and see what they were actually doing. I mean, because these were people who were taking it seriously and who got it outside of all the modern ideological filters that we have, that where modern people are reading these ancient texts with these modern filters. It would be very helpful to study what the original people were doing with these texts and with these ideas and with these traditions, because I think a lot of people who are believers are not taking it as nearly seriously enough. I mean, you read through the Gospel of Luke and you just think like, did Jesus actually mean what he said? And if the answer is yes, well, that has radical implications on how one, views, property, wealth, economic relationships, social relationships, the state, violence, all those things. And I think for people who aren't believers, but who have they want a better world than what capitalism is delivering, I think that they should think deeply about what's driving them, their worldview, and I honestly think that Christianity and the Christian tradition and that worldview is lends itself to not only not only do I think it's the true worldview, I think it's an accurate worldview that describes reality in a way that makes sense of it. But I think also I would say it's the best way you could really ground and make sense of the moral obligations that we have and the inherent human value and dignity that we have, that is ultimately based in a divine source. And that's what I believe, at least. But anyway, I really appreciate you having me on and talking with me.
Well, yeah, no, I'm happy to talk with you, man. This was really interesting, and I'll be thinking about this stuff for a while. I mean, you just gave a very good little bit on more of the Christian half of this, and I can't speak so much to the Christian half, but I can speak a little bit more to the communist half, I guess, with some experience. So yeah, I mean, I would just second what you said, but from the other half of it, which is to say that I think, and I guess I've said this in a few ways already, but anyone today who is half serious about being an anti-capitalist has to really grapple with, the overall gist of your book and kind of what you just said. Like, I mean, I'm still kind of trying to figure out how I think about religion and how I think about my Catholic upbringing and where I'm at with that. Like, I genuinely don't know, but I am trying to figure it out. And I think that is, that's the least one can do. And I think if you're really interested in overthrowing capitalism, I think, yeah, you kind of have to at least get serious about trying to figure out where you come down on these larger questions. So I think this has been really rich conversation that hopefully some people will get something out of.
If you examine these things and you come out an atheist, fine. But at least if you're saying I think the world should be some way, I'm going to strive for a sort of a better world based on some moral foundation, you at least have to examine it. And I'm not saying that you're necessarily going to come out of it a Christian, but I think that foundation at least has to be examined. And for me, that pushes me to Christianity. But it's something that at least someone should be aware of and thoughtful of.
So real quick, I'm curious, do you have like a tight-knit group of fellow Christian family who are like radical communists?
I'm part of a community, a Christian community that they have. I mean, look, it's not communist in the same way the early Christians were or anything like that, but there is a strong emphasis on mutual aid and things like that. And you know what? It's not as uncommon as you'd think that Christian communities, not all of them, but there are many Christian communities that do have a very strong emphasis on mutual aid, on caring for the for the less fortunate, and that has the strong emphasis on a mutual obligation that people have towards one another. I mean, so these exist out there. For me, my problem is the people who kind of view Christianity as just an individual thing, and it's about individual salvation, and that's it. And that's also very popular in Christianity, and I want nothing to do with that sort of cheap individual, sort of non-communal form of Christianity that just is basically a reflection. It's basically just a Christianized form of the modern, liberal capitalism, where it's almost as if like going to a religious service is like buying another commodity. You're going there, you're getting something out of it, and it's a consumption. Whereas for me, I think it should be about a community based on absolute obligations towards one another and towards God. And for me, that's the core of Christianity. It's not, about some feeling you get when you go to a service.
Right. Well, dude, that's super interesting because, sorry, I know we're trying to kind of wrap it up, but I keep having last thoughts. Something I was just thinking about is so you must feel, having written a book about how Christians are communists, you must feel some degree of alienation, given that I think it's fair to say probably the most common viewpoint of most Christians is yes, charity is good, generosity is good, but surely you must be a minority in whatever community you're in, who would say that right,
yeah,
communism,
look,
hey guys, as Christians we should actually be communists. People must
right,
kind of look askance at you, right?
Right, but the word communism, again, is a very, in my book, I basically have an entire chapter trying to take away the sting that word has, because people have very strong reactions to it. And so I don't think, I think the seeds are there. Look, the seeds are there in the text themselves, and the seeds are there in the theology itself. I mean, but it's just to sort of draw it out. And I wouldn't go around and tell people you got to be a communist or anything like that. I would just say take the New Testament seriously, and take what the theology is saying, what the teachings of Jesus saying. Take it seriously, and really take it seriously. Don't just try and think about how this is can make me feel good, or how can I get to heaven, or anything like that. But really take seriously what demands are being put. And I think and one caveat I'd have to say is American Christianity, American evangelical Christianity, is kind of its own world. It's we live in Europe, and the sort of Christian culture that's in the rest of the world outside of American evangelicalism is worlds apart. So people in the United States who are familiar with American evangelical culture, which, to be honest, American evangelicalism is not, it's not even Christianity anymore. It's like some neo. It's much more akin to sort of the national pagan emperor cults of Rome, where the emperor, the figure of Rome is important. Militarism is important. I mean, it's so completely detached from the theology of the New Testament theology that it's a lot of American evangelicalism. It'd be very difficult to even call it Christianity anymore. I mean, when you see people cheerleading for war, and cheerleading for things that would devastate poor people, and that brutalize poor people. I mean, at what point can you continue calling that Christianity?
Charismatic pastors that themselves become millionaires off of their followers.
At that point, horrifying. Are we even taught? I mean, is this even the same religion as what's described in the New Testament? I can't. I mean, I don't see it. It's
right.
The foundation, the ideological foundation on which those movements are based, are most definitely not the the foundations, the ideological foundations on which the first Christians were functioning under. Those movements very much basically just take the the liberal market ideology of modern secular capitalism and just sort of drape Jesus over it and call that Christianity. But it's not. So but then again, this is very much an American problem, and in other places around the world, Christianity doesn't have that same crutch. The so-called the political movement under Ronald Reagan really did a good job in co-opting the evangelicalism in America. So yeah, I mean, that's basically, yeah, like I said, it's barely Christianity anymore.
Hey, hang on. Sorry, someone on the thread is asking if they can ask a question real quick. So I'm gonna say, yeah, sure. Unless you're in a rush to roll. See if Zach is still there. It's interesting anyway, Roman, because like you and I are kind of symmetrical but opposite in the sense that like we're both interested in Christianity and communism, but like you're a little bit more Christian than you are communist, and I'm a little bit more communist.
I don't
experience,
consider
like,
myself that
Christian.
Political of a person. I mean, I care,
right? But
I mean,
it's just interesting how we're kind of.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Meeting in the middle.
Go ahead. It's interesting how we kind of are like mirror reflections of each other a little bit, and our emphases on these two different concepts. Like I have like I've always gravitated towards like communist kind of like living arrangements too. Like I've lived in a few shared houses, and for at least some time when I was in Philadelphia, I lived in like a massive shared house of like 25 people, and it was on like radical activist premises, and we basically lived like communists, like pretty radically, to the point that like half of the people weren't paying rent. Like I think half of the people literally, and those of us who had jobs were like paying for the people who didn't have rent, and it got way out of hand, and it was totally a disaster that went up in flames. But it was, like it was a radical communist community in some sense, and but of course it was missing the like spiritual, ethical kind of like undergirding that would be necessary probably for it to become a world historical effect. You know what I mean? And on the other hand, as a Christian, you probably have like a stronger, more stable, sustainable community around you. But I wonder if like you thirst for a little bit more radical communism than your current Christian community is able to give you.
Look, anytime you sort of have an ideology that's pushing against the dominant ideology, it's going to be very difficult to sustain that. And for me, I mean, I'm not so much a trying to sort of push this on people myself. I sort of say, think about it, take it seriously, and see where it goes. And then, I personally just think like, well, if I can do my best to at least apply these principles where I can, and other people do the same, it might not overthrow capitalism, but hopefully it might, decommodify a little bit of, my life and other people's life, to where the effects of capitalism aren't as brutal. And you know what? If enough people do it, and enough people can do it to a certain extent, who knows?
Hell yeah.
So
yeah, hell yeah.
I don't know the answer of how you can really overcome capitalism, but I do think that doing as much as you can to decommodify your life, decommodify life of other people, and trying to build a community that is decommodified, that is outside of market arrangements, that is outside of outside of market arrangements where market logic does not hold. and putting more into those, more effort into those, and having those, relying on those more than you're relying on capitalism. Now, I understand that, there's only so much that people can do in that, but I will say this: people in poor communities, like very poor communities, people in, I was recently in Nicaragua, and the rural people who live in the villages in Nicaragua, the fact that they have to rely on their neighbors, rely on whoever they go to church with for their material needs, that's something they understand. It's second nature. That people in poor communities, they have very often stronger networks because capitalism has not been kind to them. And they, capitalism at any moment is ready to kick them to the ground. So they need these social networks. They need these communities. They need mutual aid. And they need these things. And very often the way capitalism works is by destroying those communities to make people more dependent on capitalism. And we're supposed to wrap it up, but let me give you one quick example. A lot of times, rural communities will have these sort of networks of mutual aid. They'll be more or less separated from capitalism. The amount of stuff that they use that are bought and sold is not that high. A lot of what they do, they produce themselves and they share. And then, capitalism comes, sometimes the land is taken, oil is found in the area, the land is destroyed, these networks are broken up, some people move away, go get jobs in the city, and these sort of more organic, small C communist communities are broken up. So, this is not like in my opinion, resistance to capitalism is a big part of that is going to be building communities that provide an alternative to capitalism. And I think, Christianity, the communities that, were built in early Christianity were a great model for that.
Right.
Yeah. Well,
yeah, no,
the person
and
asked a question.
don't feel bad about.
I didn't.
Yeah, so I'll say that now. I was just going to say quickly, Roman, don't feel bad about having more things to talk about. We didn't need to wrap it up. I was just trying to be, respectful of your limits probably, and not overtax you. But if you have more to share, it's totally all good. I'm not in any rush. But we can continue trying to wrap it up, and we'll just take Zach's question, which you wrote now. I'll let you answer first. I have an answer too if you want me to go first. Zach wants to ask us, is it possible to use concepts such as Christian faith in purely instrumental terms, or would the usage of faith as a tool undermine the authenticity of faith and therefore numb any chance of change? So I think he's basically saying, like, if you're interested in kind of communism or radical activism or whatever, can you kind of use these ideas of Christian faith to facilitate, the creation of a communist community or something like that, without necessarily believing in it?
That's a very good question.
Just to kind of get the effects out of it. And so I have my own answer for sure, but you can go first if you have one off the top of your head.
Here's my answer. I completely. So there's a lot of people who are attached to the Christian religion who are also anti-capitalist, and they sort of will take that route, taking ideas from Christianity as to use it. I don't take that route. For me, I take Christianity dead seriously. I take I believe strongly that Jesus Christ is God's Messiah, that he was risen from the dead. Now that's what I believe, and that's the foundation, right? So for me, the most important thing is being faithful to what I believe has been revealed through Christ and Christianity, and ultimately that that there is a higher power, that God exists, and that that the world is ultimately teleological. It has a purpose, it has a value, and that was revealed in Jesus. Now, where that leads me, and where that leads me in relation to the modern systems of capitalism, of the state, and so on, that will affect how I view those things, on how I view sort of like the market capitalist ideology, the state military ideologies, things like that. But for me, my goal is to be faithful to what I believe, to Christianity, to what I believe has been revealed through Jesus. That's my goal, right? But I don't. So for me, like, people who use Christianity as sort of like a tool, like, that's kind of like what people like, Slavoj Žižek is doing. He's taking the Christian tradition and he's sort of running it through a kind of Lacanian sort of filter, and using that as like a trying to create a theology, because he realizes that ultimately, what we've just been talking about, that the radical left needs some sort of theological basis, and so he's sort of using Christianity to use that as foundation. Other people do that. For me, that's not where I'm coming from. For me, I'll use other things to remain faithful to what I believe is foundational, which is the Christian message, the messiahship of Christ, the reality of God, and so on. So that's where I'm coming from. Look,
so that's a super interesting answer from you, Roman, as a believer, as a Christian. And interestingly, I mean, I'm going to answer the question from a different perspective, obviously, more from a social scientific perspective, actually. But it's interesting to note how our answers are actually pretty convergent. So my answer to that question is, a reminder for anyone who's just tuning in. The question was, can you use Christian faith to achieve, the positive effects of having a strong belief or faith, but just to get the beneficial effects out of it, not necessarily really deeply personally believing. I think I agree with Roman that just doesn't work. But I speak not as a believer, but as someone who's looked a lot at and thought a lot about how faith works and the effects that it has, just on a kind of almost like on a biochemical level. Like, what I think about is there are the really beneficial effects that come to you and your community and so on through being like a pious, true believer. They only really get ignited if you're a really true believer. In other words, in the nature of the thing, you can't really instrumentally play it, because if you're just trying to use it, then it's not actually going to unlock the effects that true faith actually has. And so, one way to think about it is like, and this is not in any way to reduce, the depth of or this more spiritual kind of understanding that someone like Roman would like described in your own terms, not to undercut that whatsoever. But an interesting example that I think about is like, if you think about the placebo effect, the famous placebo effect. Like, if I have a headache and you give me a sugar pill, if I believe that it's like a painkiller, it's going to have a demonstrable, measurable, replicable effect on actually decreasing pain. And you find this sort of tendency in all different kinds of ways. Like, a human being's belief actually does affect like very material physical processes, such as like how your body works. Lots of evidence for that. But if I have a headache and you give me a sugar pill, I can't instrumentally use faith or belief. I can't say, if I already know all of these things, I can't like just say, okay, I'm going to try to believe that this sugar pill is actually a painkiller. And by using this faith instrumentally, it's going to it's going to affect my body in the way that I want it to. You have to actually kind of believe in it. Now,
can I just bring up another example that parallels that real quick?
Yeah, but actually, could I just finish
Go ahead.
finish one thing, saying, and then you could say it, because it's kind of a deep thought, and I don't want to lose it or get sidetracked. So that's my first level of an answer to that question. That basically, no, you have to be all in. You have to actually believe to get the community building and psychological and spiritual benefits of that, are associated with, like belief, I think. And if you try to be instrumental, it's just not going to work. But, and this is something I'm really interested in. I do wonder about a second level of an answer to that question, which is like, when you realize, like when you come to the realization that I just said, then there's almost like a third.
I missed just what you said. What did you just say? It just, the audio was a little bit choppy.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sure. No worries. I'll start over. I was really just kind of warming up to say what I was anyway, which is that if you're able to come to the conclusion that I just kind of described, then I feel like a kind of third meta level opens up, where you're kind of like, okay, well, if instrumental belief in faith is not going to work, but a true faith will demonstrably lead to the positive outcomes that I desire and believe in, well, then that itself becomes a legitimate base for taking the plunge into genuine faith. So in a weird way, there's an instrumental kind of like component. There's a realization that there are instrumental benefits to be had. And you can't fake it. You can't do it just for the instrumental benefits. But when you realize that you can't fake it and do it for the instrumental benefits, then you can decide based on that series of realizations that actually taking the plunge towards radical faith is a plunge that you're willing to take.
I agree with, well, okay. I agree that could be a way to approach it, but one, because you talked about the placebo effect, and I think that's a good analogy, but I think another analogy that works very well is falling in love, right? There's a lot of evidence that being in a long-term relationship, being married, has health benefits, more than being single. But in order to really fall in love, and to really sort of dedicate yourself, say, I'm going to be with this person for the rest of my life. This person is going to be, I'm going to tie myself to this person to where, we're going to share a life together. In order to do that, you really have to believe that this person is special, and that you love this person enough to that you're willing to give up your own autonomy, your own freedom, and attach yourself to this person for life. That has all kinds of benefits. But if you're going to lay down and write down what are the risks and benefits of falling in love, I mean, the risks and the downsides would be huge, and the benefits would be maybe, these instrumental benefits. But you look at the data, and it's clear that living in a being married, having a long-term relationship is healthy. But in a sense, you can't fake it. If you're saying like, look, I'm in love with this person because I choose to be, because it's good for me, it's healthy for me to be in love with this person, you're not in love. It's not going to work if you're trying to use it instrumentally. And I mean, that's unfortunately, even relationships get affected by capitalism, because that thinking is even pushed in relationships, that I'm going to find someone who can benefit my life. Well, it's not going to work. In order to fall in love, you almost have to completely lose yourself and throw yourself into this situation where you're giving up autonomy and freedom and handing it over to someone who you're gonna,
dude, I think that's
bind yourself
totally
to.
right.
And so I think that the faith in the Christian context is a lot like falling in love, in that sense, that
Dude, I like that a lot. I really deeply agree with what you just said, and also as a married man, I relate to what you're saying deeply. I mean, I think you really nailed something super important that a lot of people don't understand. So I couldn't have said that better myself. And interestingly, maybe that is really truly a great place to end, because this really brings us full circle if you think about it, Roman. Because is it not the case that marriage essentially the most basic elementary communist unit?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And so it's like everything you said is so true, and it really kind of shows you in a really concrete example how the relationship between faith or religion and like a deep, unbreakable communist bond or community, there's a very special kind of link between those two things that a lot of people have a hard time kind of thinking through. And I think you kind of brought it around full circle. So I love that. Yeah, thanks. That was awesome.
Yeah. I think it was Che Guevara
and
who
also
said
Zach Palmer
the
said,
true revolutionary is motivated by love. I think that was Che Guevara.
hell yeah. I think also Badiou also writes a lot about love, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
In relation to Paul and Christianity. So yeah. Zach Palmer also, for the answers, he says he guesses it's similar to what Badiou would call fidelity to the event, and I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, I'm not like a Badiou scholar, but from what I know about Badiou, his notion of fidelity to the event is exactly, basically, I think, Roman, what you were talking about, or very, very similar, and I'm very sympathetic to that. Yeah. So, Roman, thank you so much for your time and attention in this conversation. It was really, really rich, and I'm going to be digesting this for a while. So it's been awesome. Thanks, man.
Yeah, thanks. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Good. I'm glad you did. And so let's stay in touch, and who knows, maybe we'll have cause to continue the conversation some other time.
Yeah, definitely.
We'll stay in touch. Yeah.
Okay.
Awesome. Great. Thanks so much,
Thanks
Roman.
for talking.
Take it easy, man.
All right. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Thank you. Later.